There is a moment most people don't talk about. It happens late at night. Your phone is in your hand. The message is typed, but not sent. You've rewritten it 5 times already. Sometimes it sounds calm. Sometimes it sounds desperate. Sometimes it sounds like you're trying to sound like you don't care, when you clearly do. In that moment, you're standing at a quiet crossroads. Do you send the message? Do you block them to feel strong for 5 minutes? Or do you sit with the discomfort of doing nothing? I know that moment well. There was a time in my life when I believed silence meant weakness. I thought if I didn't explain myself, I would be misunderstood. If I didn't react, I would lose. If I didn't fight for connection, it meant I didn't care enough. So I reacted. I explained. I chased clarity from people who had already decided to step back. And every time I did, something small but important disappeared. My self-respect, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, piece by piece. What no one tells you is this: you don't lose your power when someone walks away. You lose your power when you abandon yourself trying to stop them. Blocking someone in anger doesn't make you strong. Begging for reassurance doesn't make you honest. Both are emotional reflexes, attempts to escape discomfort, not acts of control. This audiobook is not about how to make someone miss you. It's not about manipulation. It's not about winning someone back. It's about something far more important: taking your power back. Power doesn't look the way social media describes it. It doesn't scream. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't post quotes or dramatic exits. Real power is quiet. It's the ability to pause when every part of you wants to react. It's the discipline to sit with uncertainty without reaching for validation. It's choosing self-respect over temporary relief. I've watched people I care about struggle with this. A close friend of mine went through a breakup that left him questioning everything. At first, he blocked his ex on every platform. Then he unblocked them. Then he sent a long message explaining how much he'd grown. Then silence again. Each action felt justified in the moment. Each action was driven by emotion. Months later, he admitted something painful, but honest. I wasn't trying to fix the relationship. I was trying to stop feeling powerless. That's the trap. We confuse emotional movement with progress. But movement isn't control, and reaction isn't strength. There is a different way to respond, one that most people never learn. It doesn't give you instant relief. It doesn't feel good at first, but it builds something far more durable than approval: inner authority. At some point, I had to face a hard truth about myself. I wasn't exhausted because people were confusing. I was exhausted because I kept giving my emotional energy away, hoping someone else would stabilize it for me. The moment things began to change wasn't when someone came back. It was when I stopped needing them to. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened in small, disciplined moments. Not sending the message, not checking their profile, not rehearsing conversations that would never happen. And in those moments, something unexpected occurred. And I started sleeping better, thinking clearer, standing straighter. Nothing outside had changed yet, but everything inside had. This audiobook is built around that transformation. Not the fantasy of control over others, but the reality of control over yourself. You'll hear about silence, not as punishment, but as self-respect. You'll learn why blocking and begging come from the same emotional root. You'll understand how detachment differs from bitterness, and why focusing on rebuilding yourself quietly changes everything, whether someone returns or not. Some people who apply these principles do reconnect with others. Some don't. But every single one of them regains something far more valuable: their dignity, their clarity, their sense of direction. And that's the real win. If you're listening to this because you feel ignored, dismissed, or emotionally off balance, know this: you are not weak for caring. You're not broken for wanting connection, but you don't need to sacrifice your self-respect to prove your worth. You don't need to block them to feel powerful. You don't need to beg to be chosen. There is another response, a quieter one, a stronger one, and once you understand it, you'll never see these situations the same way again. So as we begin, I invite you to do one thing. Listen, not to fix anyone else, not to control outcomes, but to reclaim the part of yourself that reacts less and chooses more. Because the moment you stop chasing emotional certainty is the moment you begin to take your power back. And it starts now. Chapter 1. Why blocking and begging always backfire. Blocking and begging seem like opposite reactions. One feels cold and final, the other feels emotional and exposed, but at their core, they come from the same place: loss of control. When someone pulls away, the mind doesn't ask what is wise. It asks what will stop the discomfort as fast as possible. Blocking promises instant relief. Begging promises immediate reassurance. Neither builds strength. Both are reactions, not decisions. There is a moment, usually quiet, when the urge appears. You feel dismissed, ignored, unimportant. And in that moment, the nervous system takes over. Blocking feels powerful because it creates distance. But distance created in anger is not self-respect, it's avoidance. Begging feels honest because the emotions are real. But honesty without self-control is not courage. It's emotional leakage. I've lived on both ends of this pattern. There was a period in my life when blocking felt like the only way to breathe. If I couldn't see them, I told myself I was strong. If I erased access, I called it boundaries. But the truth was uncomfortable. I wasn't calm. I wasn't centered. I was overwhelmed. Blocking didn't come from clarity. It came from emotional overload. And once the emotions settled, curiosity returned. So did doubt. So did the urge to check. The block became temporary. The power disappeared. Begging followed a similar cycle. Carefully written messages, thoughtful explanations, attempts to be understood. Each message carried hope, and each unanswered message carried humiliation. What I didn't realize at the time was simple. Every time I begged for clarity, I was teaching myself that my emotional stability depended on someone else's response. That lesson sinks deep. A close friend of mine went through this exact cycle. After being left without explanation, he blocked his ex everywhere. He said it was about self-respect. 2 weeks later, he unblocked her, just to see. A week after that, he sent a message. Not angry, not dramatic, just honest. She didn't respond. That silence did more damage than the breakup itself. He later told me something revealing. I didn't want her back. I just wanted to feel like I still mattered. That's the real reason blocking and begging fail. They are not about the other person. They're about regulating your own pain through external means. And that never works long term. Power is not the ability to cut someone off dramatically. Power is not convincing someone to choose you. Power is emotional self-sufficiency. When you block someone impulsively, you tell yourself, I can't handle seeing this. When you beg someone for reassurance, you tell yourself, I can't handle uncertainty. Different actions, same message. And your mind believes what you repeatedly show it. Over time, this creates a dangerous pattern. Discomfort becomes an emergency. Emotion becomes a command. Impulse becomes identity. This is why both actions backfire. Not because they are wrong in principle, but because they train you to escape discomfort instead of mastering it. Another hard truth most people avoid: if someone is unsure about you, your reaction will not make them certain. Pressure never creates desire, and explanations rarely restore attraction. Emotional intensity usually accelerates distance. When someone pulls back, they're already overwhelmed by their own confusion, their own limitations, or their own lack of clarity. Adding more emotion to that space doesn't help. It suffocates. Silence, when chosen consciously, does something different. It removes pressure. It restores balance. It gives both sides room to feel the weight of absence. But silence only works when it is grounded in self-respect, not strategy. There is a critical distinction here. Silence used as manipulation is still dependence. Silence used as self-regulation is strength. Most people never experience the second kind because it requires sitting with discomfort without acting on it. And I once heard a simple rule that changed the way I respond to emotional stress. Never take action while your nervous system is trying to protect you. When emotions spike, the body wants safety, not wisdom. Blocking feels safe. Begging feels safe. Neither is wise in the moment. Wisdom requires pause, and pause restores authority. The moment you don't react, something subtle but important happens. You interrupt the pattern. You stop reinforcing the belief that you cannot handle emotional tension alone. That interruption is the beginning of power. Not power over someone else, but power over yourself. And that kind of power compounds. You start responding instead of reacting. You start choosing instead of chasing. You start acting in alignment with who you want to become, not what you fear losing. Blocking and begging both promise immediate relief, but they cost long-term self-trust. And without self-trust, nothing feels stable. In the next chapter, we'll look at what actually happens when you stop reacting, not externally, but internally. Because the moment you regain emotional control, you don't just change how others perceive you, you change how you experience yourself, and that changes everything. Chapter 2. The moment you stop reacting is the moment you regain control. There is a moment that changes everything. It doesn't look dramatic. No one applauds it. Nothing external confirms it. It's the moment you feel the urge to react, and you don't. No message sent, no block pressed, no explanation offered. Just restraint. Most people underestimate how powerful that moment is, because control is not something you claim, it's something you demonstrate, first to yourself. When someone pulls away, ignores you, or becomes distant, the body reacts before the mind does. Your heart rate changes, your thoughts race, your attention narrows. The nervous system interprets emotional distance as a threat, and threats demand action. That's why reacting feels urgent. That's why doing nothing feels unbearable. But urgency is not truth, and it's biology. The moment you stop reacting, you interrupt a very old pattern. You tell your nervous system, I can feel this, and still choose. That is control, not suppression, not denial. Choice. I remember the first time I truly didn't react. Not because I was tired, not because I was trying to prove something, but because I decided I would no longer let emotional spikes dictate my behavior. The discomfort didn't disappear. If anything, it became sharper at first. But something else appeared alongside it. Clarity. I could finally see how much of my past behavior wasn't aligned with my values, but with my anxiety. Reacting had become a habit. Pausing felt unfamiliar. A friend of mine experienced the same shift. After years of emotional overextension in relationships, he decided to do something different. Not to win, not to look strong, just to stop reacting. When messages were delayed, he didn't follow up. When silence appeared, he didn't fill it. When confusion surfaced, he didn't chase answers. At first, it felt like loss, like surrender. But within weeks, something changed. His mind became quieter, his sleep improved, his focus returned. Nothing external had resolved yet, but internally, he had regained ground. This is the part most people miss. Control is not about outcomes, it's about internal order. When you react emotionally, you hand the steering wheel to the situation. Your mood rises and falls based on someone else's behavior. When you stop reacting, you take the wheel back. Not aggressively, not forcefully, quietly. This doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become selective. You don't respond to every impulse. You don't chase every feeling. You don't turn discomfort into action automatically. That shift changes how you experience everything. Here's something important to understand. Not reacting does not mean you don't care. It means you care enough about yourself to respond from stability, not urgency. People often confuse reaction with authenticity. They believe, if I don't say something now, I'm being fake. But authenticity without regulation is chaos. Real authenticity includes discernment, timing, self-awareness. The strongest people are not the loudest. They are the most composed. When you stop reacting, you create space. Space between feeling and action. Space between impulse and identity. And in that space, something powerful happens. You begin to observe instead of assume. And you begin to listen instead of interpret. You begin to see patterns instead of chasing explanations. You realize how often your reactions were attempts to control uncertainty, not expressions of truth. That realization can be uncomfortable because it means you were never powerless. You were just unpracticed in restraint. Another friend once told me something that stuck. I realized I wasn't afraid of losing them. I was afraid of sitting with myself when they were gone. That fear drives most reactive behavior. Blocking tries to erase the feeling. Begging tries to soothe it. Not reacting forces you to face it. And facing it builds strength. At first, non-reaction feels like stagnation, like nothing is happening. But under the surface, something fundamental is shifting. Your nervous system learns that discomfort is survivable. Your mind learns that silence is not danger. Your identity begins to detach from external validation. That's when control returns. Not control over people, control over attention, over energy, over direction. This is why non-reaction often changes dynamics without effort. Not because it manipulates others, but because it stabilizes you. People respond differently to stability. They feel less pressure, less emotional weight, less need to defend or withdraw. Sometimes that leads to reconnection. Sometimes it doesn't. But either way, you're no longer destabilized by the outcome. That is power. There's a principle worth remembering. If your peace depends on someone else's behavior, you don't have peace. You have permission. Non-reaction removes that permission. It doesn't guarantee results. It guarantees self-respect. And self-respect compounds. You begin to act in alignment with your standards instead of your fears. You choose responses that reflect who you are becoming, not what you're trying to avoid. That's the moment things truly change. Not when someone texts back, not when clarity arrives, but when you realize you can remain grounded, regardless. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper into silence itself. Not as avoidance, not as punishment, but as a deliberate expression of self-respect, and why silence, when chosen correctly, communicates more strength than any explanation ever could. Chapter 3. Silence is not weakness. When it comes from self-respect, silence has a bad reputation. People associate it with avoidance, with fear, with losing. So when someone stops responding, the assumption is immediate. They couldn't handle it. But that assumption only applies to one kind of silence. Reactive silence. The kind that comes from hurt, from pride, from wanting to punish or provoke a response. That silence is unstable. It's loud internally, even when it looks quiet on the surface. There is another kind of silence, and it changes everything. Self-respecting silence doesn't come from emotional collapse. It comes from emotional clarity. It's not used to make someone feel something. It's used to protect your internal balance. Most people never experience this kind of silence because it requires something difficult, but emotional containment. I remember the first time I practiced it intentionally. The urge to explain was strong, not because I lacked words, but because I wanted relief. I wanted to release the tension inside me by transferring it outward. That's when I realized something important. Explaining too early is not communication. It's emotional discharge, and emotional discharge often creates regret. When silence comes from self-respect, it feels different. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel strategic. It feels grounded. You don't feel the need to announce it. You don't feel the need to justify it. You simply choose not to speak from a place you wouldn't stand behind later. A close friend of mine learned this lesson after years of over-explaining. Anytime there was confusion, he rushed to clarify. Anytime there was distance, He rushed to close it. He believed communication solved everything, but one relationship taught him otherwise. The more he explained, the more defensive the other person became. The more he tried to be understood, the less he was respected. Eventually, he stopped talking, not out of anger, but exhaustion. Something unexpected happened. The tension eased, not because the situation was resolved, but because the pressure was removed. Silence removed the emotional weight he had been placing on the interaction. And for the first time, he felt composed. That composure changed how he showed up everywhere else in his life. At work, with friends, with himself. Here's the distinction most people miss. Silence without self-respect is avoidance. Silence with self-respect is regulation. Avoidance is running from emotion. Regulation is holding emotion without letting it run you. When silence is rooted in self-respect, you're not waiting for a reaction. You're not watching for signs. You're not measuring time. You're simply not willing to act against your own standards. That's strength. Another misconception is that silence means indifference. It doesn't. It means discernment. You can care deeply and still choose not to speak. You can feel pain and still remain composed. You can want connection and still refuse to chase it. In fact, restraint often reveals care more accurately than words. Words spoken from instability tend to confuse. Silence held with clarity tends to settle. There's also something else silence does. Something subtle. It forces truth to surface. When you stop filling space with explanations, you allow reality to speak for itself. People reveal more when you stop managing their perception. Situations clarify when you stop trying to control the narrative. Silence removes distortion, and that can be uncomfortable, because sometimes the truth revealed isn't what you hoped for. But clarity, even when painful, is better than illusion maintained by effort. I once heard a phrase that reframed silence for me completely. Speak when your words improve the situation. Remain silent when they only serve your anxiety. That single distinction eliminates most regret. Self-respecting silence is not permanent withdrawal. It's temporary containment. It buys you time to regulate, to observe, to decide from alignment instead of emotion. And when you do speak, if you choose to speak, it comes from a place of calm authority, not urgency, not fear. That kind of communication lands differently. It doesn't plead, it doesn't persuade, it states. But here's the most important part. Silence rooted in self-respect doesn't depend on the outcome. Whether someone returns or not, you haven't compromised yourself. You haven't acted beneath your standards, and that matters. Because every time you choose restraint over reaction, you reinforce an internal identity. I'm someone who can hold discomfort without losing myself. That identity becomes your foundation. And from that foundation, your choices become cleaner. Your boundaries become quieter. Your presence becomes heavier. Not because you say more, but because you no longer need to. In the next chapter, we'll talk about detachment. Not cold detachment, not bitterness, but emotional detachment. The kind that frees you without hardening you. Because the goal isn't to stop feeling, it's to stop being controlled by what you feel. Chapter 4. Detach emotionally, not bitterly. Detachment is one of the most misunderstood concepts in emotional growth. Many people think detachment means becoming cold, distant, unreachable. They imagine shutting down feelings, cutting people off, or pretending not to care. That isn't detachment. That's armor. And armor is heavy. Real detachment doesn't harden you. It frees you. Emotional detachment means you allow feelings to exist, but you don't let them dictate your behavior. It's the difference between feeling pain and becoming pain-driven. Most people don't struggle because they feel too much. They struggle because they act while flooded by emotion. Detachment is what creates space between those two. I learned this lesson slowly. There was a time when every emotional shift outside of me created turbulence inside. Thus, a delayed reply affected my mood. Distance felt personal. Silence felt like rejection. I told myself I was sensitive, that I cared deeply. But what I really lacked was separation. My emotions were fused with outcomes, and when outcomes changed, so did my sense of stability. A friend of mine went through something similar. He wasn't dramatic, he wasn't reactive, but he was emotionally attached to interpretation. Every action was analyzed. Every pause was explained internally. Every silence was filled with meaning. It exhausted him. Eventually, he realized something crucial. He wasn't attached to the person. He was attached to certainty. Detachment began when he stopped demanding answers from situations that couldn't provide them. That's when emotional freedom started. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. Caring is open. Clinging is tight. Caring allows movement. Clinging demands control. When you cling emotionally, you try to manage outcomes. You track behavior. You read into tone. You search for reassurance. Detachment removes that need. Not because you don't want connection, but because you no longer need it to feel stable. There is a subtle shift that happens when detachment is practiced correctly. You stop monitoring. You stop checking. You stop rehearsing conversations that may never happen. Not through force, through disinterest in emotional chaos. One of the clearest signs of healthy detachment is this. You don't need to know what someone is thinking in order to move forward. You accept uncertainty as part of reality, and acceptance restores energy. And I once asked someone how they knew they were emotionally detached. They said something simple. I stopped needing emotional updates to feel okay. That's it. Detachment doesn't announce itself. It shows up as quiet stability. You still feel disappointment. You still feel loss. But those feelings no longer control your schedule, your sleep, or your sense of self. Another important distinction. Detachment is not bitterness. Bitterness keeps you tied to the past. It's emotional attachment disguised as indifference. When someone says, I don't care anymore, but still feels tension, resentment, or the need to prove something, they are not detached. They are stuck. Detachment feels neutral. There is no urge to punish, no urge to teach a lesson, no desire to withhold as leverage. You simply stop investing emotional energy where it no longer belongs. This is why detachment often feels uncomfortable at first, because it removes familiar drama. Without emotional highs and lows, the mind feels empty, bored, unstimulated. But that emptiness is actually space. Space to rebuild focus, space to rebuild identity, space to redirect energy inward. One person I know described detachment this way. It felt like stepping out of a noisy room I didn't realize I was trapped in. That's an accurate description. Detachment quiets internal noise. And in that quiet, you regain perspective. You start seeing patterns instead of moments. You stop personalizing behavior that has nothing to do with you. You recognize when something is misaligned and you stop forcing alignment. That's maturity. Detachment also changes how you relate to others. You listen more. You react less. You don't rush to fill silence. And because you are no longer emotionally grasping, your presence becomes lighter. People feel that, not consciously, but intuitively. Detachment removes pressure. Sometimes that pressure was the only thing pushing people away. Sometimes not. But either way, you are no longer chasing emotional equilibrium through others. You've learned to carry it yourself. That's the core of emotional strength. Not the absence of feeling, but the ability to feel without losing direction. In the next chapter, we'll shift focus outward again, but in a very different way. We'll talk about what happens when you stop trying to prove a point, stop performing growth for attention, and start building yourself quietly, without witnesses. Because real change doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Chapter 5. Focus on building yourself, not proving a point. There is a stage many people get stuck in. They stop reacting, they stop explaining, they stop chasing, but internally, they are still performing. Every improvement becomes a message, every success becomes a signal, every change is quietly aimed at being noticed. This phase looks like growth, but it's still centered on someone else. True self-development begins when there is no audience, when you stop trying to prove that you're strong, when you stop hoping someone will realize what they lost, when your progress no longer needs to be witnessed to feel real. I've seen this shift happen in people close to me. One friend decided to change his life after a relationship ended. At first, everything was public. Gym photos, quotes about discipline, visible routines. And it wasn't fake, but it wasn't grounded either. He was still communicating, not with words, but with effort. Eventually, he grew tired. Not of improving, but of performing. So he stopped posting, stopped hinting, stopped checking who viewed his progress. And something unexpected happened. The improvement became lighter, more consistent, more sustainable, because it was no longer fueled by emotion, but by alignment. This is where real power is built, quietly. When you build yourself for validation, you become dependent on feedback. When you build yourself for alignment, you become stable. There is a difference between becoming better and becoming centered. Centered growth doesn't rush. It doesn't announce milestones. It doesn't demand recognition. It compounds slowly but deeply. Yes, one of the hardest habits to break is this: doing things so someone else will feel something. Even positive change can be distorted by that motive. You start measuring success by reaction instead of substance. But reactions are unpredictable. Substance is not. I learned this lesson personally. There was a time when every productive day secretly carried a question. Will this be enough for them to notice? That question drains energy, because it places your direction in someone else's hands. The day I stopped asking it, my focus returned. I worked better, rested better, lived cleaner, not because I was motivated, but because I was no longer distracted. Building yourself in silence does something important. It removes comparison. Without an audience, there is no need to rush, no need to compete, no need to exaggerate progress. Well, you move at your own pace, and that pace is usually faster than you think. Another friend once said something that stuck with me. When I stopped trying to look healed, I actually healed. That's the core idea. Looking strong and becoming strong are not the same. Proving a point keeps you tied to the past. Building yourself prepares you for the future. This shift also changes your relationship with effort. Effort stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like structure. Your routines become anchors. Your habits become identity. Not because they impress anyone, but because they stabilize you. There is a quiet confidence that comes from private discipline. No one sees the early mornings. No one notices the restraint. No one applauds consistency. But you feel it, and that feeling doesn't fade. It accumulates, so that you stand differently. You speak less, but more precisely. You stop over-explaining because you're no longer trying to convince anyone. You are grounded in what you are building. This is where self-respect turns into self-trust, and self-trust changes how you relate to everything. You don't rush outcomes. You don't force connections. You don't negotiate your standards. You let time and behavior reveal what belongs. Building yourself quietly doesn't guarantee that someone will return, but it guarantees that if someone does, they meet a stronger version of you. And if they don't, you haven't built your life around absence. You've built it around direction. In the next chapter, we'll talk about what happens when you truly stop chasing. Not externally, but internally. Because the moment you stop chasing emotionally, so you begin attracting differently. Not by effort, but by presence. There is an uncomfortable truth most people avoid. As long as part of your growth is aimed at being seen, you are still emotionally attached. It doesn't matter how disciplined you look. It doesn't matter how productive you become. If your improvement is secretly asking for recognition, it is fragile. Because the moment no one notices, motivation collapses. Building yourself for attention keeps you dependent. Building yourself for alignment makes you independent. This is where many people confuse silence with progress. They stop talking, They stop reacting. But internally, they are still waiting. Waiting for a reaction, waiting for validation, waiting for someone to notice the change. That waiting drains energy. True self-building begins when waiting ends. When your effort no longer asks, "Will this be seen?" but instead asks, "Is this who I want to become?" That shift is subtle but profound. It turns growth from performance into identity. One of the hardest things to accept is that no one owes you recognition for changing. Growth is not a negotiation, it is a commitment. When you build yourself quietly, you remove emotional bargaining from the equation. You are no longer improving to compensate for loss. You are improving because it is aligned with your standards. That alignment creates peace. Not excitement, not adrenaline. Peace. And peace is what allows consistency. People often chase motivation, but motivation fades. Alignment doesn't. When your actions match your values, effort becomes natural. You stop asking if something is worth it. You do it because it's who you are. That's when improvement stops feeling like recovery and starts feeling like construction. You are no longer fixing yourself. You are building forward, and that forward momentum matters. Because life does not reward explanations. It responds to structure. Structure in your habits. Structure in your thinking. Structure in how you invest your energy. When you build yourself without witnesses, you gain something rare. Internal certainty. You no longer need to prove that you're better. You know. And knowing removes the urge to show. Chapter 6. When you stop chasing, you start attracting. Chasing doesn't always look obvious. Sometimes it's constant messaging. Sometimes it's checking profiles. Sometimes it's emotional availability without boundaries. But chasing always has one thing in common. It places your center of gravity outside yourself. When you chase, your attention follows. And wherever your attention goes, your power follows too. Most people don't realize they're chasing. They tell themselves they're being open, understanding, patient. But underneath those words is often a quiet urgency, a need for reassurance, a need for resolution, a need to feel chosen. That need changes your energy. People feel it, even if they can't explain why. I once watched someone I cared about slowly lose their balance this way. They weren't dramatic. They didn't beg. And they were just always available, always responsive, always accommodating. They believed availability created closeness. But over time, the dynamic shifted. Their effort increased. The other person's effort decreased. Not out of cruelty, but because imbalance creates distance. This is where the idea of attraction gets misunderstood. Attraction is not about playing hard to get. It's not about withdrawal as a tactic. It's about stability. People are drawn to those who are anchored in themselves. When you stop chasing, you don't withdraw emotionally. You withdraw dependency. That shift is subtle, but powerful. Your mood stops hinging on responses. Your plans stop revolving around potential messages. Your sense of worth stops fluctuating. That internal steadiness changes how you show up. You speak with less urgency, but you listen without needing confirmation. You give attention, but not at the expense of yourself. One friend described this moment perfectly. I realized I was trying to earn comfort from someone who was already unsure. Once he saw that, chasing lost its appeal. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared about his own balance more. When you stop chasing, silence feels different. It's no longer a threat. It's just space. And space reveals truth. If someone values you, space doesn't erase that. If someone is uncertain, chasing won't fix it. But chasing will cost you clarity. That's why stopping isn't passive. It's corrective. You're correcting the imbalance between effort and dignity. Another important shift happens when you stop chasing. You stop negotiating your standards. You don't overextend to keep connection alive. You don't shrink to stay included. You don't explain yourself into exhaustion. You allow mutual effort to reveal itself. And if it doesn't, you accept that information without panic. That acceptance is rare, and rare energy is attractive, not because it's mysterious, but because it's grounded. Attraction is a byproduct of self-trust. When you trust yourself, you stop forcing alignment. You stop trying to control timing. You stop mistaking urgency for intimacy. Your presence becomes calm, and calm presence changes dynamics. Sometimes that change leads to renewed interest. Sometimes it leads to closure. But either outcome feels clean. Because you didn't abandon yourself trying to keep someone. You stayed centered. There's a quiet confidence that emerges when you stop chasing. You don't announce it, you don't display it. It shows up in restraint, in pacing, in patience. People respond differently to that, not because you're doing something to them, but because you're no longer doing something to yourself. Chasing creates pressure, presence creates ease, and ease invites connection more naturally than effort ever could. In the next chapter, we'll talk about discipline. Not discipline as control, but discipline as a way to rebuild self-respect day by day. Because attraction fades without substance, but self-respect compounds, and that's what sustains you, no matter who stays or leaves. Chasing is exhausting because it requires constant adjustment. You monitor tone, you analyze timing, you recalibrate effort based on response. That constant recalibration keeps you mentally occupied. And mental occupation is the opposite of presence. When you stop chasing, your mind becomes available again. Available for work, for clarity, for direction. That availability is felt, not consciously, but energetically. People are drawn to those who are not emotionally preoccupied. Not because they are indifferent, but because they are grounded. There is a calm authority that comes from not needing anything to happen. That authority cannot be faked. It emerges naturally when your self-worth is no longer tied to outcomes. Stopping the chase does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop over-investing before reciprocity is clear. You allow effort to be mutual, or you step back without resentment. That choice preserves dignity. And dignity is attractive in a way effort never is. Effort can feel heavy. Dignity feels light. When you stop chasing, you also stop over-interpreting. You no longer search for meaning in delays or silence. You allow behavior to speak plainly. This reduces emotional noise, and reduced noise sharpens perception. You begin to see situations as they are, not as you fear them to be. That clarity protects you. It prevents you from chasing illusions. It prevents you from forcing alignment where none exists. And that prevention saves time. Time you can invest elsewhere, in growth, in purpose, in people who meet you where you stand. Attraction is not about pulling someone toward you. It's about being so internally stable that movement toward you feels safe. Stability invites curiosity. Curiosity invites connection. But even if connection never comes, stability remains. And stability is the real reward. Chapter 7. Rebuilding Self-Respect. Through daily discipline. Self-respect is not restored through words. You don't talk yourself into it. You don't think your way back to it. And you don't regain it by waiting for someone else to see your value. Self-respect is rebuilt through action. Quiet action. Repeated action. Daily discipline. Most people think discipline is about forcing yourself to do hard things. It's not. Discipline is about keeping promises to yourself, especially when no one is watching. When you've been emotionally shaken, self-respect erodes subtly. You start questioning your instincts, your standards soften, your boundaries blur, not because you want them to, but because your nervous system is tired. Discipline restores order where emotion created chaos. I didn't understand this at first. I thought healing would come from insight, from understanding patterns, from closure. But insight without structure changes nothing. The real shift began when I introduced simple, non-negotiable routines. Nothing dramatic. Wake up at the same time. Move my body. Do the work I said I would do, even when motivation was gone. Avoid reaching for emotional relief during moments of discomfort. Each act was small, almost unimpressive, But together, they rebuilt something important. Trust. Not trust in others, trust in myself. A friend once described discipline in a way that stayed with me. Every time I don't send the message, I gain a little respect for myself. That's discipline. Not reacting when you want to. Not checking when curiosity spikes. Not breaking your own standards for emotional comfort. Those moments add up. And over time, they change your internal posture. You stop feeling fragile. You stop feeling reactive. You stop feeling like your emotions are emergencies. Daily discipline also creates rhythm. When life feels uncertain, rhythm becomes stability. You may not control outcomes, but you can control effort. You can control consistency. You can control where your energy goes. That control grounds you. There's another important aspect of discipline most people overlook. It removes negotiation. When you're emotionally vulnerable, you negotiate with yourself constantly. Just this once. Just to feel better. Just to get clarity. Discipline eliminates those internal debates. You already know what you do and what you don't. That clarity conserves energy, and energy, when preserved, turns into confidence. Not loud confidence. Quiet confidence. The kind that doesn't need reassurance. As discipline compounds, something shifts in how you carry yourself. You don't rush conversations. You don't overshare. You don't seek emotional validation from unstable sources. Because your sense of worth is no longer dependent on mood. It's anchored in behavior. Another person I know experienced this transformation after months of emotional instability. He didn't change his personality. He didn't adopt new philosophies. He just stopped breaking promises to himself. He showed up every day, even when it felt pointless. Months later, he said something simple. I don't feel impressive. I feel solid. That's the goal. Not intensity, not inspiration. Solidity. Daily discipline also changes how you respond to setbacks. When discipline is in place, setbacks don't feel personal. See, they feel temporary. You don't spiral. You don't collapse. You adjust and continue. That resilience is attractive, not just to others, but to life itself. Opportunities tend to find people who are stable enough to handle them, but even if nothing external changes immediately, something internal does. You begin to respect your own boundaries. You begin to value your own time. You begin to trust your own restraint. And that trust is everything. Because once you trust yourself, you no longer need someone else to stabilize you. You become steady. In the next chapter, the final chapter, we'll talk about letting go of outcomes entirely. Not with indifference, but with maturity. Because the final step in taking your power back is releasing the need to control what happens next. Discipline is often misunderstood as rigidity. But real discipline is flexible where it matters and firm where it counts. It adapts to circumstances without abandoning standards. When you commit to daily discipline, you are not controlling life. You are controlling your response to life. That distinction is everything. Because life will remain unpredictable. People will remain inconsistent. Discipline is what keeps you steady inside that unpredictability. Each disciplined choice sends a quiet message inward. I can rely on myself. That message rebuilds confidence at its core. Not confidence based on success, but confidence based on follow-through. Follow-through builds identity, and identity stabilizes emotion. This is why disciplined people don't overreact. They trust their process. They trust their routines. They trust themselves to recover. Daily discipline also restores timing. When you're emotionally shaken, everything feels urgent. Discipline slows the internal clock. It reminds you that not everything requires immediate action, that patience protects you from regret. Another overlooked benefit of discipline is emotional containment. You don't suppress feelings, you schedule them. You allow space for reflection, but you don't let emotion hijack behavior. This containment creates maturity. You stop dumping emotion into situations that can't hold it. You carry it yourself. That ability to carry your own weight emotionally is self-respect. And self-respect changes how you move through the world. You stop over-explaining. So you stop apologizing unnecessarily. You stop compromising standards for comfort because you know what you're capable of sustaining. Discipline teaches you that. Not through theory, but through repetition. And repetition builds certainty. By the time discipline becomes natural, you no longer think in terms of control. You think in terms of alignment, and alignment is the foundation of lasting power. Chapter 8. Let the outcome go. Keep the power. At some point, there is one final attachment you must release. Not attachment to a person, not attachment to the past. Attachment to outcome. As long as you need a specific ending to feel whole, your power remains conditional. You tell yourself, I'll be okay if they come back. I'll have closure if they explain. I'll move on once I know. But that moment rarely arrives the way you imagine. Because closure given by others is unstable. It can be delayed. It can be incomplete. It can be taken away. Real closure is internal. And it begins when you stop negotiating your peace with the future. Letting go of outcome does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop placing your emotional well-being on something you cannot control. This is one of the hardest lessons to accept. Because hope feels productive, expectation feels purposeful, but expectation is also pressure. Pressure on time, pressure on people, pressure on yourself, and pressure quietly erodes power. I've seen people stay emotionally suspended for years, not because they were weak, but because they were waiting for a different ending. They didn't want to move forward until the story made sense. But life doesn't always explain itself. Sometimes the explanation is the experience. Letting go of outcome is not resignation. It is maturity. It is the recognition that you can walk forward without knowing exactly how things will resolve. That confidence changes everything. When you stop needing a specific result, your behavior shifts. You no longer act to influence. You act to align. You don't calculate timing. You don't rehearse conversations. You don't imagine alternate futures. You show up fully where you are. That presence is power. One person I know described this shift simply. The day I stopped hoping for a different ending was the day my life restarted. That's not defeat, that's release. Release from emotional suspense, and release restores energy. When outcome no longer defines you, your standards become clear. You stop asking, what should I do to keep this? You start asking, what kind of life do I want to live? That question moves you out of reaction and into direction, and direction is the opposite of helplessness. Another important shift happens here. You stop interpreting everything personally. Not because you detach emotionally, but because you understand something fundamental. Other people's actions are shaped by their capacity, not your worth. Once that truth settles, resentment fades. Not instantly, but naturally. You no longer need to defend yourself internally. You no longer need to prove anything. Your value is no longer on trial. This is what it means to keep your power. Power is not control over endings. It is control over standards. It is the ability to say, regardless of how this turns out, I will not abandon myself. That promise changes how you experience uncertainty. Uncertainty stops feeling like danger. It becomes possibility. Possibility to grow, to redirect, to build something stronger than what was lost. Letting go of outcome also deepens your patience. You understand that timing is not something to force. It is something to respect. You trust that clarity arrives, not when you chase it, but when you are stable enough to receive it. That trust creates calm, and calm sharpens judgment. From that place, your choices improve. You choose relationships more carefully. You invest energy more deliberately. You protect your peace without aggression. You don't rush replacement. You don't cling to memory. You move forward with dignity. And dignity, once restored, becomes your baseline. This is the final shift in taking your power back. Not winning, not being chosen, not being understood, but being whole, without permission. When you reach this point, something surprising happens. You stop thinking in terms of loss. You see everything that didn't work as information, everything that ended as redirection. And redirection is not punishment, it's guidance. The outcome may still matter, but it no longer defines you. You define yourself, and when you do, nothing outside of you can take that power away again. There is a subtle grief that appears when you truly let go of outcomes. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of releasing fantasy. Fantasy about how things were supposed to end, about how someone was supposed to realize your value, about how time was supposed to correct what went wrong. Letting go of outcome means letting go of those imagined endings, and that can feel like loss, even when you are gaining freedom. Most people resist this stage because hope feels safer than acceptance. Hope keeps the story alive. Acceptance closes the book. But a story that never ends becomes a prison. You stay emotionally suspended, not moving forward, not fully letting go. Outcome attachment does that. It keeps you waiting, waiting for a message, waiting for regret, waiting for timing to change. But power does not live in waiting. Power lives in authorship. The moment you release outcome, you reclaim authorship of your life. You stop living in response mode. You stop framing your days around what might happen. You begin acting from intention instead of anticipation. That shift is quiet, but irreversible. Once you experience it, you cannot unsee the difference. You realize how much of your past anxiety came not from pain, but from resisting uncertainty. When you stop resisting, uncertainty loses its edge. It becomes neutral, and neutrality is freedom. Like another important realization surfaces here. Letting go of outcome doesn't mean you no longer desire connection. It means you no longer depend on it to feel complete. Desire without dependence is clean. Dependence without control is suffering. This is where emotional maturity fully forms. You allow life to unfold without forcing it into meaning. You accept that some people leave without explanation. Some situations end without justice. Some questions remain unanswered, and still, you move forward intact. That integrity matters, because integrity is what keeps you from repeating the same cycles. When outcome no longer dictates your behavior, you stop negotiating your boundaries for potential futures. You choose based on alignment, not fear. That choice changes your trajectory. You don't chase closure anymore. Yet you create closure through decision. You decide what you stand for, what you tolerate, what you invest in. That decision is final, even if circumstances are not. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when you stop asking life to confirm your worth. You no longer wait for signs. You no longer interpret silence. You no longer read between lines that were never meant for you. You read yourself instead. Your energy returns. Not explosively, but steadily. You begin to enjoy simple things again. Focus, routine, presence. These are signs of power returning, not power over people, power over direction, and direction gives life momentum. This is also where forgiveness becomes possible. Not forgiveness to excuse what happened, but forgiveness as release from emotional debt. You stop carrying what no longer belongs to you. So you don't need to rewrite the past. You don't need to justify it. You accept it and step beyond it. That step is quiet, but it is decisive. Letting go of outcome is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of living without emotional leverage over yourself. You become harder to destabilize, harder to manipulate, harder to pull out of alignment, because your center is no longer external. And once your center is internal, nothing outside of you gets to decide your worth again. That is what it means to keep your power. If there is one truth that ties everything you've heard together, it is this. Power is not something you gain from others. It is something you reclaim from yourself. Throughout this audiobook, we never talked about winning someone back. We never focused on changing anyone's mind. We never promised a specific outcome, and that was intentional. Because the moment your peace depends on an outcome, you have already given your power away. What you've learned here is not a tactic. It's a posture. a way of standing in your life without leaning emotionally on uncertainty. You learned why blocking in anger doesn't heal, why begging for reassurance weakens self-trust, why reacting gives control to situations instead of reclaiming it. You learned that silence, when chosen consciously, is not avoidance, but self-respect, and that detachment is not coldness, but emotional clarity. That discipline is not punishment, but structure. And most importantly, you learned that letting go of outcome is not giving up. It's growing up. I want to speak to you now, not as a narrator, but as the person who wrote this. There was a time in my life when I believed strength meant endurance, holding on, explaining myself until I was understood. I thought if I just said the right words or waited long enough, things would eventually make sense. They didn't. What changed my life was not clarity from others. It was clarity about myself. The moment I stopped asking, "What can I do to fix this?" and started asking, "What kind of person do I refuse to become?" that question became my anchor, because it redirected my focus from control to character. Character is the only thing you truly own. You don't control timing. You don't control other people's capacity. You don't control how things end, but you do control how you show up. You control whether you abandon your standards under pressure. You control whether you trade dignity for temporary relief. You control whether you react or respond. And those choices shape your life more than any outcome ever will. If you take nothing else from this audiobook, take this. Never sacrifice your self-respect for emotional certainty. Certainty fades. Self-respect compounds. There will be moments after this where old urges return. You'll feel the impulse to check, to explain, to seek reassurance. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you're human. The difference now is that you recognize the impulse for what it is. A request for comfort, not a command for action. You don't have to obey it. You can pause. You can breathe. You can choose restraint. And every time you do, you strengthen something inside yourself that cannot be taken away. I've seen people apply these principles in different ways. Some rebuilt relationships on healthier terms. Some walked away with peace instead of resentment. Some discovered entirely new directions they wouldn't have seen otherwise. But all of them regained something essential: inner authority. They stopped outsourcing their worth. They stopped negotiating their standards. They stopped living in reaction mode, and their lives became quieter, but stronger. That's the kind of strength no one applauds, but it's the kind that lasts. And as you move forward, don't focus on being unbothered. Focus on being aligned. Alignment means your actions match your values, even when it's uncomfortable, even when no one sees it, even when the outcome is uncertain, especially then. Because life doesn't reward desperation. It responds to stability. And stability comes from within. You don't need to block them. You don't need to beg. You don't need to explain yourself into exhaustion. You need structure, restraint, self-trust. And those are built one decision at a time. If you're listening to this and someone comes back into your life, you'll meet them differently. Not from need, but from choice. And if they don't, you'll still move forward intact. That is the definition of power. Before we end, I want to leave you with something practical. For the next 7 days, commit to 3 things. Do not act while emotionally flooded. Do one disciplined action daily that strengthens your structure, and refuse to negotiate your self-respect for comfort. That's it. Not dramatic, not complicated, but transformative. Because real change doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from quiet consistency. Thank you for listening, not just with your ears, but with your willingness to reflect. If this audiobook helped you, share it with someone who is struggling to let go, someone who keeps reacting when they want to feel powerful again, someone who needs to remember that their worth does not depend on being chosen. And if you return to this message in the future, let it remind you of who you decided to become when you chose restraint over reaction. You didn't lose your power, you just forgot where it was. Now you remember, and this time, you keep it. One last thing is worth saying before this ends. Taking your power back does not mean you will never feel shaken again. It means you will no longer be ruled by those moments. There will still be days when memory returns unexpectedly, when silence feels heavier than usual, when part of you wonders if choosing restraint was worth it. In those moments, remember this: strength is not the absence of doubt. It is the refusal to let doubt dictate your behavior. Every time you choose not to react impulsively, you reinforce a deeper identity. Someone who does not abandon themselves under pressure. That identity matters more than any single relationship because it follows you everywhere, into your work, into future relationships, into the way you handle loss, into success and uncertainty. This is how people quietly outgrow their past, not by erasing it, not by rewriting it, but by no longer living from it. When you stop seeking emotional permission to move forward, life opens in unexpected ways. You become selective instead of desperate, present instead of preoccupied, calm instead of reactive. And calm people see clearly. They choose better. They invest wisely. They walk away without burning bridges or themselves. That clarity is not luck. It is earned through restraint, through discipline, through the quiet decision to stand by yourself when it would be easier not to. If you remember nothing else from this audiobook, remember this: your power does not come from being wanted. It comes from knowing you will be okay, even if you are not. And once you truly know that, nothing external has leverage over you anymore. That is freedom.